Welcome to the video lecture for Lesson 2. Before we get into Lesson 2, we are going to take a few moments to just recap what we covered so far in Lesson 1. We've covered so far in this class what is economics, scarcity and its role in decision-making, the difference between a want and a need, understanding what a good and a service is, how and why we use opportunity cost, and most importantly, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. In this lesson, we are going to be going over what goes into producing a good or service and why it should matter to you. During this lecture, please make sure to be completing your Lesson 2 note-taking guide. In the right-hand column, you should be taking notes to answer the questions or give definitions to the key terms that show up. Please feel free to also use the open space to write any questions you think of while listening to the lecture. This note-taking guide is due by midnight tonight. The first thing we're going to talk about are what are consumers and producers, and why does this have anything to do with you? A producer is someone who makes or produces a good or service to sell. A producer can be somebody who owns a small, simple little business like a lemonade stand, or somebody who owns a massive Fortune 500 company here in the US or around the world. It literally is anyone who produces a good or service to sell to another person. And who is that other person? That is what a consumer is. A consumer is someone who buys or consumes a product or service. In the terms that we tend to use in real life, we tend to refer to consumers as customers. Why is this important to you? Producers and consumers are actually the two groups that ultimately determine what is made or produced in this country, and it is their relationship that also determines the price of all goods and services. They do this through an economic concept known as supply and demand, and we will cover that more in Lesson 3. The most important relationship in economics is the relationship between producers and consumers. For this particular lesson, we are going to focus on producers who are business owners, but it is important to remember that producers can also be something as complex as the US government, and we will talk about them more in Unit 2. Before we get too far into Lesson 2, what I want you to do is I want you to take a little bit of time to think like a producer. So, consider a loaf of bread. In your notes, write down all of the different steps that would need to be taken to get that loaf of bread to a grocery store. Go ahead and pause the video now. How many steps did you come up with? For each of you, you may have come up with a number of different steps depending on how much you know about the production of bread. Ultimately, though, it is important to consider that a loaf of bread doesn't just come growing out of the earth, but instead requires the actual production of the bread, the production of the plastic that it is packaged in, all the way down to the trucks that need to drive it to the grocery store. So there's an infinite number of steps depending on how much you chose to break it down. The process of coming up with how to answer those or how to produce something ultimately come back down to what we refer to as the 3 economic questions. The 3 economic questions are the questions that every producer or business owner must ask themselves before they decide to open a business or produce a good. So, for example, some of you had discussed in your Getting to Know You forms that you had been interested in starting your own business in the future. These are the 3 economic questions that you would have to ask yourself. What to produce, how to produce it, and who to produce it for. Before we go into the details of the 3 economic questions, I want you to take a moment to do a quick write. Why do you think a business owner or producer would need to ask themselves these 3 questions before starting their own business? How will these questions help them? Go ahead and pause the video now. The first of the 3 economic questions is what to produce. Since all resources are scarce, as we discussed in Lesson 1, no society or business can produce everything for everyone. Therefore, all businesses and producers must try to decide what to produce. When they're trying to decide what to produce, they have to consider what goods or services are actually wanted and needed in this moment. You have to consider what resources do they have access to produce the good or service they are going to make? And finally, what are the opportunity costs of producing different things? Let's use this forest as an example. Here is this beautiful forest here in the United States of America. There are multiple things that can be done with a forest. One option is to set it up as a national park. There could be ranger stations, they could charge fees and parking charges for people to come visit the forest, but it would keep the forest alive and whole and protected. The downside to that is you never actually use any of the raw material resources that are located in that forest. Another option for the forest is to start cutting it down and using it for logging. By cutting down the trees and turning them into wood, they then could be able to sell that wood to companies to produce homes, businesses, bridges, roads. All of it could be used for the betterment of human society. The downside, though, of doing that, or the opportunity cost of doing that ultimately, is you destroy the forest, a natural resource that will have a very hard time growing back if it's constantly being cut down. So when a producer is trying to decide what they want to produce, one of the things they have to consider is what are the opportunity costs of every possible thing they could produce with the resources they have and with the ideas of goods or services that are either wanted or needed at that time. The second question they have to ask themselves is how to produce it. As a producer is trying to determine what they are going to make, they also need to consider how they are going to make it based on a few things. They need to consider what resources they have access to, their own creativity or the creativity of those around them who may be able to help them come up with ways to create their product or service in the cheapest way possible. As well as they have to consider their own skills, education, or training in the production of their good or service. For example, many of you may have just realized you are never going to be producers of bread because you may have no idea how bread is made, in which case you don't have the training and or skills or education yet to produce bread. So that might not be the best thing for you. These questions ultimately force a producer to have to consider another economic concept known as the factors of production. The factors of production. These are the items needed by a producer or business to produce a good or service. In economics, we consider 4 different things, the factors of production: entrepreneurship, land, labor, and capital. The first factor of production is entrepreneurship. We often refer to this, though, instead as entrepreneur because it's usually a person that is developing an idea and turning it into a business. An entrepreneur can be someone who is starting a small business like a local restaurant. They can be a person who has a big, massive startup company. They could even be a CEO. They are the ones that are coming up with the idea for the business and ultimately taking the risk of having to gather all the factors of production to produce the good or service. The entrepreneur is important because they are the ones who are ultimately going to feel the greatest success because of the business doing well, or the greatest failure if the business does not. The entrepreneur is the idea person and usually then the manager of whatever company is created. The next factor is land. Land is just short for all natural resources available to produce a good or service. It can be any natural resource you can come up with: wood, oil, metal, water, actual land, sunlight, raw materials needed to produce other materials for a good or a service. For example, if you need plastic, you don't just go outside and dig up plastic, even though there is a lot of waste. And I'm sure you could find it. You actually need different chemicals to help you produce that. So those chemicals would be the raw materials or the land needed to produce that product. The next factor is labor. Labor is the work done by the employees to help bring about a product, a good or a service, to the market. It could be any type of job that you have people doing to help get your product or service made. It can be anything from picking crops to stocking shelves at a grocery store to constructing a building to creating an app. All of that are different forms of labor. Capital is the final factor of production, and it can be the most confusing because there are 2 different types of capital. The first is physical capital. Physical capital are any man-made objects that are used for production. That can be something like money, tools, like a simple hammer or saw, machinery, like these automated robots who are building the cars, to chemicals. The other type of capital is human capital. Don't get human capital confused with labor, even though labor and human capital both reference some aspect of human beings. Human capital, on the other hand, is knowledge, training, or education needed for production. This can be having experience in a particular field, being trained in something, or having a degree in a particular field. For example, as a teacher, I might need the physical capital for distance learning teaching. I might need a laptop and Wi Fi, but the human capital that I have is a degree in history, a teaching credential, and experience having taught economics. Now let's bring this all back to the three economic questions: how to produce it and the factors of production. Business owners and producers have to consider what factors of production they have access to in order to determine the best way to produce their good or service. They want to make sure that they can make the most money possible, which means they don't want to spend too much money. So then when they're considering their factors of production or how to produce their good or service, they want to make sure they are using their resources to the greatest advantage with the least monetary and opportunity costs. They do not want to waste money on anything they don't have to. The final economic question is who to produce it for. The final question a business owner must consider is, who are their customers? They will want to consider this because it will help them determine how much they may be able to sell their good or service for, which will go hand in hand with how much they want to spend to produce it. For example, if a business owner knows that they're producing a new cell phone, but they want to make it so that it's cheaper for more people, they may then know that they need to find a way to produce it at a cheaper price. If they want to produce a children's toy, they have to consider the fact that children cannot buy their own toys. So they're going to have to make sure that they can figure out how to produce it in a way that will allow most families to be able to still afford it. They will also need to consider how they will need to market or advertise their good or service to their customers and how much of it to produce. Some companies purposefully try to produce too few of their items because they know their customers will be willing to pay an exorbitant price for it. For example, the company Supreme is famous for this. Last year, they sold a pack of Oreos, red Oreos, that said Supreme on them for over $25,000. Just a pack of double stuffed Oreos for $25,000, and they only produced one case of them. So they knew that they could charge people that much. They knew who their customers were, and therefore they knew how much they could spend to produce it and how much to sell it for. So what does this all have to do with you? This relates to all of us in the following ways. Next time you're in a store, remember how much thought went into producing the good or service you are about to buy. If you plan on starting your own business, these are the things you have to consider in order to make sure that your business starts with a clear mind and a clear plan. And finally, these questions are not just asked and answered by businesses, but also by your own government. So, next time you're wondering what the government is doing with our tax money, pay attention to what they are spending it on and see if you can figure out how they answer the three economic questions.